so our philosophy with these older formats is definitely a lot more based on the community sentiment, given how, when you're a legacy player, you have to invest a lot into playing legacy. Same with vintage, owning Power 9, owning all these fetch lands, duels, it's difficult. So when we talk about these sort of formats, we really want to make sure that we're listening to the community first and foremost. So we like to track, obviously we'll still track win rates, play rates, all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at these graphs and think, hey, is there anything crazy here? But unlike for those other formats, we're going to focus mostly on how the community is talking about the format and if they enjoyed the most.
It's that time again. Another scheduled ban and restricted announcement is happening at the end of the month. What do I think is best for Vintage? Welcome back, Vintage gamers, to a pre-ban and restricted announcement video. I feel like I am pressured to do one of these for every scheduled ban and restricted announcement due to the way that Vintage and Legacy are predominantly governed by community sentiment as the driving factor for restrictions and bans. So I want to make sure I get my voice out there and it's not a silent voice that doesn't affect at all and leave only the people who are upset as the only voices of our community. That being said, I do want to preface that I try to keep this as fair and unbiased as I possibly can. I think my role in the community, and especially in terms of how loud my voice is, I don't want to drown out other players just because I have a large platform. I play a lot of matches and I have the ability to share my view to more people. So I want to keep that in mind as we go. And let's just talk about Vintage. It's going to be a little bit of a rambler. I don't have a pre-scripted video here. I just want to talk about the format, what I think is good, what I think is bad, and what we should do moving forward. So why don't we just go take a look at this sheet here. This is going to be my Vintage data sheet that we run with the community, that we keep track of all the MTGO challenges and showcases and RCQs and those things. And this is going to be a compilation of all of that match data into here, where we'll be able to see what's happening in Vintage in terms of what decks are being played, what win rates are happening. And thankfully, I guess at the last time we've updated this, overhauled the archetypes after the Saga restriction, I do have Lurrus separated out here because that will be probably a main focal point of this video. So let's talk about things that I would like to see considered when thinking about bans and restrictions. Data in terms of win rates and in terms of meta share. This is a pretty straightforward one because these kind of things have been mentioned in the past. Win rate is when a deck has over a 55% win rate, typically without mirrors, though we can only do without mirror estimations. WotC and would have more information than us for that kind of thing, and they would also have league data, which is a larger pool to pull from. But in the past, they've cited 55% win rate as the win rate that they start to look at. Is this too strong? So we have that as a very nice baseline, and then we have meta share. This is actually a little bit more complicated because you can't just say, does a deck, you have to look at it from a deck perspective, a card perspective, and then just like a feeling perspective, which is a really weird way to go about doing some numbers things, but hear me out. The card Lurrus right now, and this is the full data sheet, and we'll look at some smaller amounts of time as well, because I think it's actually important right now. But Lurrus appears, or Lurrus decks with Lurrus have a 30% meta share, which is very high. However, it's not actually, it's very high in the context of all of Magic. It's very high in that sense, but it's not actually very high in the context of Vintage. Vintage is actually, when you're looking at this kind of archetypal level, 20% is a very normal meta share for something like Bazaar, all Bazaar decks or all Workshop decks or something like that. And when you really break it down inside of Lurrus, Lurrus is not really a good indicator of an archetype level breakdown, because inside of Lurrus, there are both combo and control decks, combo and fair blue decks. Right now, it's closer to 20% in this set of data is like closer to 20% fair blue decks and 10% combo blue decks inside of Lurrus. So you could say that the fair blue deck is actually 15%, and the combo is actually, or sorry, the fair blue deck is actually 20%, 25%, and the combo is 10% into here, which would make combo 25%. And then you actually have a really balanced archetypal level meta share where you have almost all the archetypes at 10 to 20% between shops, bazaar, aggro, combo, and control, and like fair blue. So actually, from that sense, you have that going on. But then you also have to think like from a card, like I said, from a card level. This is a Lurrus card you're seeing, and your 30% of your opponents have a Lurrus. So if that's something that you are worried about, that's the thing to think about. And like so that does matter. So like when Urza's Saga was seeing its extreme amount of play as a 4 of, it was in a really large percentage of decks, like 60% of decks or something. I don't remember the actual number. And so you're seeing it in a lot of games, and that kind of can fatigue players. But it's also kind of a weird thing to think about because we see, we can pull this data, not from my sheet because I don't have deck lists in this sheet, but Goldfish has some, top 32 pulls of popular cards, which is a pretty reasonable approximation for this kind of thing. 67% of decks have Force of Will. Is anyone complaining about Force of Will has too much meta share? It's a little hard to say. Like right now, you end up with 20% of decks have Thunder Trap Trainer because the Lurrus PO meta share is really high. Even now the one Urza Saga, 66% of decks are playing that one. But Unrestricted Wasteland is in 45% of decks. So it's kind of hard to think about exactly. Unrestricted Lorien Revealed is up there, Stock Up is up there, but Unrestricted Force of Negation is up there. So these are hard things to quantify. So those are kind of the terms people usually use for data, win rate and meta share. Then you also have things like play patterns, and this is a balance between diversity in play patterns and how much the average player is enjoying play patterns. So there is an idea of what is a good play pattern, but that doesn't mean, and there is an idea of what is a fun play pattern, but what is fun for one player is not always going to be fun for the other, and frequently won't be fun for the other. And so the idea of a good play pattern is more an aggregate. And I don't think I'm extremely versed in that kind of game design theory so that I could like definitively say what is a good and bad player, but I will speculate and I'll let you know when I am speculating. But for the most part, some of these historical vintage decks like Bazaar of Baghdad and Mishra's Workshops, especially like Prison Workshops, even Jewel Workshops, these decks are not what you would consider to be typically in game design as good play patterns. But vintage has an identity, so that's another thing to think about when you think about the format identity, as being a place where you can play with all of the most powerful cards that have ever been printed. And instead of totally outright banning the most broken cards, you end up restricting cards so that you can still experience these powerful effects. And that's going to be a big point later on when it comes to something like Lurrus. So while Dredge and Sphere Shops might not really, exist in a curated metagame of something like a standard format, they are allowed to have their home here in vintage, but you probably don't want them to be an overwhelming amount of meta share. Now, what is that meta share number? Who knows? That's a thing that someone has to determine and say, this is too much. But that's not an exact science either. And so something you want to consider is that typically this is going to lead to you want to have the highest meta share deck be something that is not going to produce play patterns that people typically don't like. And that is usually going to be some kind of controlling mid-range or tempo deck that is not doing something inherently broken and unfair. So that's why, in general, I'd like the top deck on the format and the deck people are gunning to beat to be this Lurrus Frog deck. This Lurrus Frog deck is an excellent example of a tempo deck, an excellent example of a tempo/control deck that is not doing any unfair-based combos. Now, that doesn't mean because it's not doing unfair combos, it doesn't have play patterns that can be not enjoyed by some players. Things like getting Wasteland out of the game can be a play pattern that people don't like. Just having every spell you cast get countered could be something players don't like. But these things are hard to quantify. So typically in general, I would like that kind of deck to be the top of the deck, but you still want that deck to be a good deck, but not a broken deck in terms of win rate. And right now, let's go into the thick of things here. What I'm going to do is I am going to shorten this set of matches. Right now, it's a 44,000 match data set with some really great numbers. Like if you looked at just this data set, you're looking at since the restriction of Saga. So this is almost a year ago now, but not quite there. 10 months. You're looking at a wide range of decks at the top of the metagame here. 4 decks are very played. If we combine this Lurrus control deck, we have 1 deck more at the top, but I would say then you'd have 3 very played decks and then an additional 5 moderately played decks and then maybe an additional 10 smaller meta shares. And among these decks, nothing is broaching that 55% win rate. And even if some of these ones that were lightly played were approaching the 55% win rate, you'd have to still count in this 95% confidence interval. So I usually explain that. It means that given the amount of data we have, there's a certain amount of standard deviation and variance in what could be the true win rate of the deck. So the more matches you play, the smaller the the smaller the confidence interval that you are 95% confident that the true win rate lies within. So even for something like Initiative, which is the most played deck in this data set, we're still going plus or minus 1.3%. So that 1.3% is the difference between Initiative being a positive win rate deck and a negative win rate deck, winning more than 50% of their matches or losing more than 50% of the matches. So that even at the very smallest data set, you still have this confidence interval. And so some of these could have their true win rate be above 55%, but they could also be as low as 52%. And 52% is a totally normal win rate for a very good deck. So I would say you can't be super confident, and even if you were, like, you can still say a 55% winner deck is totally fine for the format. But it's just a line we can draw to start looking at a deck if it's doing too well. And so these are smaller, meta shares. So let's say the first deck with a really strong win rate here is this Lulek Lurrus controlled deck at a 54% win rate, a strong but not a strong but not overwhelming win rate here. 54%. It could be as high as 55.5 or as low as 52.5. So the difference is, maybe the difference between those two numbers is as much as a good deck versus maybe a broken deck, you could say. So right now, you have some decks that are performing really well, but nothing that is overwhelming the format, and nothing that has a very good win rate and is the most played deck. However, I think it's important to look at a more recent metagame because while this is nice historical data, it's not accurately reflecting what's happened over the past few months. In the past few months, we've actually got the printing of stock up, and the printing of stock up has changed the texture of the field and what decks are doing well. So you're going to notice here that we're actually cutting off almost half of our data. We only have 20,000 matches to look at now. And then when we come down here, you can see the new most played deck is actually Lurrus PO instead of Initiative. Initiative is now the third most played deck. If you combine these two Frog decks, that becomes the most played deck at around slightly under 500. So right now, the most played deck in the format is the Frog deck. When you combine those two win rates, the Frog deck has almost a 53% win rate, which is good, but not overly broken. And when you're looking at your Lurrus PO deck, which is the next most played deck, 53.5. And you're seeing here, again, none of these decks are really approaching that 55% win rate, especially when you consider that some of these are lower play rate numbers. And you're looking at, even the Lurrus PO deck, the most played deck, has a 2% plus or minus. The 2% would put it up to 55.4, so maybe a deck we should take a look at. But if it was at the lower end of that, it was a 51%, then it's a deck that we don't really care, or we're excited to have that as a balanced deck at the metagame. So when we're looking at the number one question right now in this talking point for ban and restrictions is, are there any decks that have a broken win rate, have a high win rate that needs to be addressed? The answer is no. Right now, Vintage is balanced and I would say very diverse. you're looking at this deck. If you're separating out these Lurrus Frog decks, and that's a totally valid thing to point out, would be like, you are separating Blue Black and Lurrus Frog. They should be combined. For the purpose of the sheet, we're looking at more like matchups and stuff like that. So that's why they're separated. But for the purpose of like metagame share, I think they should be combined. So I will try to frequently reference them as together. But even when you combine them together, it's 500 plays, and it's only a combined meta share of 15%. So the most played deck in the format is a 15% meta share. The second most played deck in the format is an 11% meta share. These are really good numbers for diversity and meta share. So not only can you reasonably conclude from what we're looking at here that the format is balanced, the format is also diverse. 22% shops. Again, we can separate out 15% of, let's see, actually, 1, 2, 15, 16. I usually put these are usually fair decks, 17. So I would say 17% of these Lurrus decks are fair blue decks, going down here to be 21% fair blue decks. And then the rest of that portion would be 16% or so combo decks. So they go up into here to 29, 30, almost 30% combo. This is a really nice meta share spread. You can play any kind of deck in this format and do reasonably well. Now, some of these are 49%, but that's not too bad. 49% is definitely within the confidence interval of being a deck that's winning more than often than it's losing. And so I would consider all of these decks from Lurrus PO all the way down to Tinker PO to be normal meta share, normal decks to see in a tournament and decks that can win a tournament. Even down here at like Beseech Storm, which is one of the lower play decks of the thing at 47.3% win rate, that's not unplayable deck. That's a deck that's having a bad time in the metagame, but it's also a deck that has a lower amount of data, so we don't exactly know its true win rate. Its true win rate is somewhere. Am I doing the wrong thing? Beseech is fine. It's Oath that's having a bad time, and that's actually much more reasonable. Oath has been struggling into the recent field, but even there, that's a 4% confidence interval. So it's absolutely possible the true win rate of Oath is 51%. So, anyways, the main point we're trying to hit here is under the metrics of data that include win rate and that include meta share, Vintage is balanced and diverse. And these are the two of the biggest possible things that you're looking for when you're talking about a ban and restricted announcement. Those ban and restricted announcements are primarily for addressing balance and diversity in a format. Secondarily, we can think about something more abstract like fun, and we'll get into that next. So before anyone wants to say anything about win rates balance and meta share diversity, this is a diverse format. Now, some people are going to argue that 35% of the decks containing Lurrus is not diverse. I don't really get that argument. Yes, those decks contain Lurrus, but a Lurrus doesn't make a deck its own thing. Lurrus is just a defining cardin that we're trying to track, but these decks are absolutely very different decks. No one should be arguing that the Frog deck is a same deck as a PO deck, right? And so the defining factor of these decks isn't Lurrus, it's what they're trying to do inside of the deck. Are you trying to play Frog, tempo control? Deathfire Shaman is, again, a little bit on that mid-range tempo control. PO is definitely a combo control deck. Breach is a combo control deck. And these decks are all different decks. We are only calling them Lurrus as a way of tracking them. So we should now move on to fun. So how should a ban and restricted announcement manage fun? Are players enjoying the gameplay? And my personal opinion on this is that bans and restrictions should not be things that are adjusting fun or adjusting staleness. Players who play a lot of Magic will end up becoming burnt out from the format that they're playing and end up being upset about the format that they're playing, having the same things happening over again. But that's just because they are the ones who are playing an extreme amount of games. This is a very common thing that happens in every game I've played. I play a lot of games at high levels. Teamfight Tactics is one of the biggest ones, and that's a game that is on like a 2-week rotation in terms of metagame updates. Every 2 weeks, they put out a patch and they change numbers. And even in those 2 weeks, some players will say the game is already stale. and that's just because of extreme play rate. So you have to think the average player, how many games is the average player playing? And so for the people who think that a metagame is stale, and for Magic, these metagames can last longer periods of time, they will sometimes call for bans and restrictions to try to shake things up. And I think bans and restrictions should not be used for shakeups. What should be used for shakeups is, number one, new card printings. And we've already seen how that can happen with the stock up into 11. Stock up was a new card printing that changed the format. It brought combo back into the forefront after Frog was dominating at the top of the metagame, and now Frog is still the best deck probably in the format, but these stock up combo decks have breathed new life into a set of decks that had previously been struggling. So new printings is the number one way. And now Vintage can have a hard time with that sometimes because new printings that affect Vintage are fewer and farther between. But in recent sets, with the power creep and newer sets, you've actually seen plenty of cards come down into Vintage. Thundertrap Trainer is a defining point of this Lurrus PO deck, and that's a very new card in the grand scheme of things. And then the second way I would like to address people who are, complaining about something like a stale metagame or a metagame they've seen too many times, is unrestrictions. Unrestrictions are a way that you can introduce new cards to a card pool without printing new cards and adjust and shake up a metagame without removing cards, which is very much against the spirit and the format identity of what Vintage is. Vintage, again, is that format where you can play every card throughout Magic. You can play the most powerful cards that you're not allowed to play in other formats. So I would say last video I said I did not want to do any unrestrictions. Why did I say that? I didn't want to do any unrestrictions because the format was not in a state of equilibrium where it's not changing, where people are getting burnt out and it is becoming quote unquote stale. We had just had the stock up printing shake up the format. We wanted to see where things landed. Did the Lurrus PO deck end up becoming the most broken deck in the format? And the answer was no. For a while, Lurrus PO deck was very good, but as typically happens in Vintage, decks can adjust, swap out permission, put in different cards, and now we're looking at a point where the Lurrus PO deck cannot be considered anything other than a good deck and a balanced deck. But it's not a broken deck. It's definitely a good deck. Do not get me wrong. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it and say that deck is not good. It's very good. It might be the second best deck in the format. But you are allowed to have best decks in a format. That's totally okay. There will always be a best deck in a format. It's just when it does too well over too long of a period of time. So before I said no unrestrictions because we were still in a state of flux. I no longer think we are in a state of flux. I think the metagame is cycling. The Lurrus PO deck and the Lurrus Frog deck can only sideboard so many cards for so many matchups. And if you start trimming sideboard cards for something like Dredge or Doomsday or Sphere Shops, one of those decks will jump up and be able to prey on your metagame. So if I haven't seen Sphere Shops in a while, I'm going to stop boarding my Hercules recalls. All of a sudden, Sphere Shops has an opening to start actually putting up really good tournament results. And I think that's the best possible place for these kind of more linear, typically unfun gameplay strategies to exist. When they are, good choices for certain weekends based on metagame cycles, I think that's a great place for those kind of decks to exist. They should always be at the power level to win tournaments, and I think they always are, even when they're in a bad metagame spot. But when you are rewarded for picking a good metagame spot by playing one of these lower meta share percentage decks, I think that's a really nice pattern for players to get into. So now that I say that I think our format is out of the state of flux, it is now in a state of small cyclical cycles. Unrestrictions make tons of sense to me right now. I would like to do some unrestrictions, and I would like to do them in a way that addresses community sentiment. So let's talk about community sentiment. What is the community thinking right now? The number one things I hear around the community, and I think I have the biggest ear in the community at the moment because I have probably the most eyes on people talking about Vintage between the Discord, which is probably the largest English-speaking place to talk about Vintage, between my stream and my YouTube. I think I see, and of course paper events, not to discount those, I think I see and hear the most things that Vintage players are saying. Now, I should also preface this by saying this is specifically for English-speaking Vintage players. And that is a major point because I don't speak Japanese, and I want to make sure that if anyone's watching this, that we recognize that the most vintage is being played on Magic Online, right? But the most paper vintage is being played in Japan. Japan probably has the largest vintage community anywhere in the world. And because I can't read Japanese, obviously I can Google Translate and see what some people are saying, but those are the only people who are playing and talking online. And I still try to communicate with the Japanese scene as much as I can, but there's barriers there. I don't want to say that even the things that I hear in terms of the community are the whole story, because they are not. And this is something that I brought up a long time ago when people were talking about format panels. If there was ever to be a vintage panel, I would highly push for there to be a Japanese paper representative in that kind of panel, because that's a huge portion of the scene that I am not hearing in terms of community sentiment. And I know it's probably hard for the WotC employees who are running the ban list to hear. So that's another reason that I get worried when community sentiment is a big portion of the ban and restriction announcement talk, because what if you can't hear the community sentiment? So that's just a side point. From what I hear inside of the English-speaking communities, from what I hear about community sentiment, there are a few smaller groups that are vocal about certain sets of things, and I'm going to lay them out for you to the best I can. Historical workshop enjoyers are upset because they feel their deck is not strong enough. Typically, that is specifically represented in prison shops or sphere shops. I would say generally, I feel like this is due to a couple factors. One, workshops used to be the best deck in Vintage, and I'm not talking about Lurrus PO Esper Frog numbers. I'm talking about 30% meta share, 60% win rate, dominate the format. Everyone's playing ingot chewers. Workshops used to be the whole format. So these players are coming from a place where they, expect their deck to be one of the biggest meta shares and one of the biggest players, and it's not right now. And it's not even putting up winning numbers right now. That's not to say Sphere Shops is bad right now. I do think Sphere Shops is actually pretty good. It's pretty good into this Lurrus PO deck that's currently being played, and it has great metagame holes in the cycle where it's actually quite strong, but it's not as historically strong as those players expect it to be. And they are looking for unrestrictions because their deck has suffered many restrictions in the past. That's one of the things people are talking about. Historical dredge decks, dredge players, Bazaar players in general, there are two things that Bazaar players are talking about. One is they don't think Dredge is powerful enough. And Dredge has a similar, I feel, issue to Shops, but in definitely a less powerful, or definitely a less drastic sense. There was a period for a few years where Dredge was the best deck in the format by far. It was it's over 55% win rate for almost a year, and it was basically winning most of the online events for a whole year. Dredge is not that strong now. This was before the Gargari Grade Troll got restricted. So that's something that Dredge players are complaining about. And then some Bazaar players are also complaining about the fact that there was a period of time where you could play Dredge, you could play Hogak, or you could play Countervine, the Squee deck, and they were all pretty viable. That is no longer the case, and you can really only play the Dredge deck. There are some metagames where the Countervine deck has some play, but not entirely. I'm just going to go through all of the things, and then we'll go circle back on how I'd like to have those kind of complaints addressed, if they should be addressed. So that's those two. And then the big one, the number one is Lurrus. Now, this is a hard thing to discuss because, like we've talked about, Lurrus is not an overwhelming win rate, Lurrus is not an overwhelming meta share. Lurrus is a balanced and reasonable addition into the most powerful format. And again, the format's identity is you can play all of the most powerful things and nothing is removed. There are some players who strongly dislike Lurrus, and that has a lot of basis inside of how the companion rollout happened, how the companion rollout affected all of the other formats, how companion had to be nerfed in all the formats. One of the craziest things in Magic history, for sure. And people don't like the gameplay of having this 5th card in exile that you can access. I would never argue that Lurrus isn't one of the best cards ever printed, and definitely considered a broken Magic card. It is by far one of the best cards ever printed. It might be the strongest ever card ever printed, and you can sometimes even argue unnerfed. It might have been the strongest card ever printed in Magic. Those things are actually at least arguable. However, as it currently stands, is Lurrus too good? And the answer is no. There's no data metric you can say where Lurrus is too good. So if you want to get rid of Lurrus from the format, which again is kind of breaking the whole idea of the format where you can play all the most powerful cards ever made, but you can't restrict Lurrus like you could with something that was powerful and a spell. So what do you do? Like what do we want to do about it? So you're really arguing that the format will be more fun and the gameplay will be better if Lurrus is gone. That seems like to be the primary argument to remove Lurrus. There's also a secondary thing that people talk about where they talk about, you can't play 3-drops with Lurrus there, and we want to free up 3-drops, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So that's one of the other primary things people are complaining about inside of community sentiment. And there's also a 4th group that is just saying, hey, we want to play with cool and powerful cards, and there's cool and powerful cards on the restricted list that are no longer good, and we want them freed. So that's the 4th group. So let's go through all of those groups and see what we can do in the idea of shaking up the format using unrestrictions. Sphere shops. Can we do an unrestriction that would satiate players who are not as happy with the current state of sphere shops? Looking through the restricted list here in Vintage, you have multiple options on things you could technically unrestrict inside of workshop decks. Chalice of the Void, Karn, Lodestone, not Artifact Mana, we won't even bother talking about that. Memory Jar is a workshop card, but it's a little more confusing than that. Thorn of Amethyst, Mystic Forge, Vexing Bauble, and Trinisphere. And you'll notice that most of these cards are restrictive lock pieces that prevent players from actually being able to ever play the game. And we've already seen with the restriction of Vexing Bauble that WotC believes that these kind of restrictive pieces that don't let someone play the game are under the unfun play patterns idea. So it's highly unlikely things like Trinisphere or Chalice of the Void would ever come off the unrestriction list. So then you go down to things that are less egregious than that, and there are 2 that stand out. You have a Lodestone Golem, and you have Thorn of Amethyst. Now, Lodestone Golem, the counter argument to Lodestone Golem is fine is because it's a creature, you can actually remove it with creature magic. The argument against that is also it's a creature, it has 5 power, it wins the game very fast while also being able to make your opponent not play any spells. There's the thing where Lodestone Golem doesn't actually tax Moxen, so the Moxen decks are not actually as worried about Lodestone Golem as the non-Moxen decks. So this is going to hurt decks that are not playing full Moxen, and typically decks that are on like the Fairer or the non-Moxen combo side, which are not decks that are particularly doing extremely well into the metagame. And like it's going to hurt decks that are not playing as much removal. So it's not really even going to hurt like Lurrus control Frog deck as much. So I think the easiest and most straightforward thing here is to unrestrict Thorn of Amethyst. Thorn of Amethyst is a card that is probably the weakest lock piece that is restricted, and a card that isn't even always that good when you're playing it inside of these workshop decks. You almost always want the Sphere over the Thorn. There are a lot of creatures running around in Vintage right now. So what does unrestricting Thorn do? This is going to give a boost to Sphere Shops. And it will give a boost, theoretically, to some of these aggro-oriented decks that are creature-based. And that's a theoretical. Those decks are historically very bad. And giving them 4 Thorns is unlikely to push those decks into a place where they become good. But it will do something in that sense. So we're talking about trying to shake things up, slightly maybe changing balance, but not using the big hammer of a restriction that will have permanent rippling effects for years to come. Something like an unrestriction of Thorn of Amethyst would make a lot of sense in the current Vintage environment. moving down to the people who are upset right now about the state of Bazaar. I don't think you can do things that actively make these like Hogak and Countervine decks better. We actually saw that with the restriction of Vexing Bauble, and it didn't really pan out in the way that Countervine becomes super playable all of a sudden. Same with the restriction of Saga, that kind of buff Countervine again. But these decks are just like fundamentally falling behind in the metagame, and I don't believe you should be manufacturing the certain decks to become playable. I don't think that's the point of a ban restriction list. You're not, if you want new decks to be able to come back up, the way you do it is you print new cards. So Trainer and Stock Up revived a pretty much dying Paradoxical Outcome archetype. But I don't think you would want to like use the ban list to do that. So when we talk about Dredge, I don't think Dredge is too weak right now. I actually think Dredge is one of the best choices you can play. Right now, it's say right around a 50% win rate. But again, it plays really well in certain metagame holes when people are not boarding the right things, when people are thinking it's not very good. That's when it's at its best. It actually has some really nice gameplay, really nice strength against the current versions of Lurrus PO, which is one of the most played decks in the format. So Dredge doesn't really, in my opinion, need a boost right now in the same way that I think Sphere Shops kind of doesn't need a boost. But the difference here is that unlike Sphere Shops that has an EC unrestriction of Thorn that probably doesn't make a huge splash, but it does shake up the metagame, the only card that can really be even talked about to upgrade Dredge is this Golgari Grave Troll. And I don't think that would be wise. I believe that would push Dredge into an unacceptable power level. The reason that Golgari Grave Troll was restricted in the first place is still valid. So, there's theoretically a world where you could maybe say do a swap where you take Golgari Grave Troll off and then put a different card on. But that gets a little dicey. You don't exactly know how that's going to fare. Golgari Grave Troll is very unique inside of Dredge, where it's the highest Dredge, a Dredge 6, and it's green to augment your Force of Vigors. So I think the risk is extremely high here. And if we're talking about shakeups using unrestrictions, that would be probably an unacceptably high risk and something that has a high chance of having to be reverted. I think when you start on this restricted list, there are so many cards here that are low risk that don't have very high chance of having to be reverted that it makes more sense to start with the cards that are low risk, but rather than immediately going to high risk. So I would not address any complaints inside of the community for Bazaar's power level right now. And I also think that they're kind of unfounded in the sense that I don't see the Dredge deck as underperforming. It's not exceeding, and it's not a great deck right now, but I don't think it's a bad deck right now. It's just an okay deck right now. And then you get down to, let's skip Lurrus for a second and we'll go to the people who want to free Magic cards. They want to free cards, and that's a totally fun and exciting way to shake up and draw interest in the format. So I'm very much about that. And I think the number one card people want to see, especially for some historical vintage players, is Channel. It's not highly unlikely. It's unlikely that Channel produces a deck that is too good in vintage. However, it is not impossible, which I think actually ups the intrigue and the draw of a Channel unrestriction. The Channel unrestriction is going to make players want to come and see, wow, what does Channel do? In the same way that Splinter Twin did in the modern unrestrictions. I think it's very analogous to Splinter Twin. I think Splinter Twin is shown to not be very powerful in current modern, but it's still something that excited everyone, and I think that's the same thing that Channel can do here. So I would say unrestricting Channel would be my way to satiate the community sentiment towards unrestricting interesting cards, I should say, not fun, because this is very much a one-sided kind of fun. But if, Channel as a one-sided kind of fun ends up in the same meta share as some of these other, Beseech Storm, is that really a problem? No, it's probably just adding to the texture of what is already vintage. So I like Channel. There are plenty of other things on here that you could do this style of no longer at the same power level as it was before style unrestrictions. You have things like Windfall and theoretically Necropotence, but that's obviously a little more risky. What was the one that everyone, Library of Alexandria. There are a couple other ones in that category, but I think Channel is by far the one that fits the Goldilocks zone of Splinter Twin, where it is intriguing enough that people really want to try it, and powerful enough that it might do something, but still on the same side, unlikely to drastically change the metagame. So I would put Channel as my card that I would like to see unrestricted for those players in the community. And then it comes down to Lurrus. And there are only two ways to satiate a community sentiment towards they don't want to see as much Lurrus. And one is to completely remove Lurrus from the format as a ban. And I think that would be a horrible idea. Why do I think it'd be a horrible idea? Because what does Lurrus do? Inside of the PO stock-up deck that is already one of the best decks in the metagame, not that much. Those decks immediately just transform into Tinker Karn decks. And in my opinion, Tinker Karn is a much worse play pattern than Lurrus. And then what does Lurrus do to these frog decks? Well, they might not even have the power level to keep competing. They might. I don't know the answer. That one is certainly up for debate. Who knows if Lurrus frog decks still get to be a powerful controlling part of the metagame anymore. Lurrus is much more of a focal part of that deck. And if that deck were to drastically disappear from the metagame, you're losing your reasonably sized portion of the metagame that is fair blue, and pushing those players into playing things like combo Bazaar and shops. And that is very scary. If any of those kind of archetypes get more players, that becomes a dominant archetype in the field and can become very bad very quickly in terms of gameplay. So I have high concerns that a Lurrus ban would make for worse gameplay. So if I don't want to do a Lurrus ban, and I don't, let that be clear, what do I want to do, and how do I want to address the community sentiment towards maybe there's too much Lurrus in the games that they play? And I think the number one way to do that is unrestrict cards that may no longer be needed to be restricted because they do not fit into Lurrus decks. And there are a couple ones that fit this mold, but I want to pick out the two that I think make the most sense. And the two that make the most sense are Monastery Mentor, 3-drop creature, and Narset, Parter of the Veils, 3-drop Planeswalker. Both of these cards have some of that amount of could be very good in them. They were certainly focal points of the metagame at the time of their restriction. However, some decks these days that can play Monastery Mentor, and those decks exist, don't get me wrong, like these, there are still Tinker players in the field. 3, 6, maybe 7, maybe, let's say conservatively 6% of the field. Oh, let's go up with 1% here with the Breach players. Maybe 7% of the field is still non-Lurrus combo decks. Some of those decks are not even opting to play the first Mentor. Now, be real, Mentors compound on each other in a way that, is incentivized by certain deck building, right? But it's certainly a card worth chasing, and probably a card that is no longer as strong as it used to be. And so if you unrestrict Mentor, you're giving players who are looking to play a deck that is not a Lurrus deck some extra tools to make it worthwhile. Right now, the choice between playing a Lurrus and playing cards that are above 2 mana as permanents is hard to justify playing the non-Lurrus. The only justifications you typically get are, I really want to play Tinker Citadel in this metagame, or I really want to play Karn to beat other Moxen decks in this metagame. And there have been points along the weeks that has been actually a good choice. Isaac Bullwinkle has done multiple challenge top 8s now with a Tinker PO Karn deck. Straight up, just almost the exact same deck as the Lurrus deck, but just choosing to play Karn and Tinker over playing Lurrus. And it was totally worthwhile for him in those weeks. I think we can make it so it's a closer choice. And unrestricting Mentor is definitely a way you can do that. This is a card that kind of fits inside of both the most prominent Lurrus decks archetypes. So like if you consider the Lurrus Frog deck to be this kind of like tempo-y controlling deck, then Mentor was very good, and actually at its best, maybe you could consider at its best inside of the classic Jeskai Xerox decks that used to exist. Don't use that word. Only I'm allowed to use that word, and we're getting rid of that word. Ah, man, Justin, what have you done? Anyways, those style of decks. And then it's also was played a lot inside of the Paradoxical Outcome combo decks. So this is going to give those kind of decks a reason to theoretically abandon Lurrus for some 3-drops. Narset is another one, and Narset is definitely a card that has some bad feelings behind it from players. Players really disliked when Narset came out, and it's very clear to see why when you look back at deck lists around the Narset time. When Narset was printed, it is not like how Vintage is today. Today, Vintage has a lot of creatures. Every deck has creatures, people have removal spells, and people aren't really trying to play as many draw spells as they used to be. There's not really that many decks playing Preordain. And the decks that used to do a lot of drawing, like the PO deck, now have a lot of, not draw in their deck in terms of stock up, putting cards in your hand, and Thundertrap card putting cards in your hand. I actually think Narset is not very good now as the first copy of Narset. I don't frequently include Narset in my non-Lurrus combo decks anymore. It's always had a hard time being cast at 1 blue, and now it's even harder because there are creatures that are attacking it. Unlike Karn, that has this really high Planeswalker point total, Narset can only go down, and it's very important to try to keep the Narset in play. If it even gets hit by one like Thundertrap Trainer or Urgish Bowmaster attack, this card can immediately lose its ability to activate a second time, or it can immediately lose its ability to stay in play. And when this card is not staying in play, you're looking at the top 4 cards for a non-creature, non-land twice. People are already doing that with things like Thundertrap Trainer and stock-ups, right? I think Narset is a super safe unrestriction that does promote some kind of non-Lurrus, blue, kind of more combo-oriented decks typically with the Narset, but you can also put it inside of things that are being more controlling and trying to be more stacks-like a theoretical, I don't know, like a blue-white, like Clarion Conqueror style deck. I think Narset is so far past the point that we were at when it got restricted that we should absolutely be trying to see where it stands in the current set of the metagame. I think we're in a much healthier place in Vintage in terms of how many creatures are in the format. When I first started playing Vintage, the format was extremely about, blue decks playing on the stack, and then like really restrictive artifact decks and really powerful Bazaar decks. Now there's a lot of things happening on the ground with Lurrus and Frog and Thundertrap Trainer, and Mono White Initiative is the real cause of that. Mono White Initiative being a strong enough deck that people had to respect has put people into the position where they are also playing creatures and removal. So for the Lurrus people in the community, and I think even if I disagree with the things people are saying in terms of Lurrus, you still have to be cognizant of the people who are upset about whatever, any kind of play pattern. Like, there's, of course, you have to listen to people who are like, oh, Bazaar is super unfun to play against. I don't want to see it too often. And then you also have to we need to still make sure you can play Bazaar for the people who really are into Vintage for playing Bazaar. So it's all a balance. And so for those people who are not super happy with Lurrus, I think unrestricting Mentor and Narset will give players more of an opportunity to make the choice to forego Lurrus in their decks and instead play 3-drops. I think in general, the idea that Lurrus stops you from playing 3-drops is not exactly, or prevents 3-drops from being played is not exactly lines up in my head. For the most part, Vintage decks have always historically played 1 or 2 3-drop permanents in their deck ever, even when there was no Lurrus. Once you start getting up to higher mana cost, the bar for power is extremely high. It needs to do something extremely powerful for you to invest 3 whole mana in it. And when you get to the point where it's 4 mana, it has to really win the game. And typically, these 1 and 2 3-drop cards are typically the worst cards in everyone's decks. The Dak Fadens and the Okos and stuff. These cards are clunky and hard to use. And I don't really feel I feel more like Lurrus is encouraging players to build better decks. And maybe that would go away, I guess. If say Lurrus was gone, maybe players will start building worse decks again because they want to play with these 3 cards. But saying that Lurrus is stopping people from playing mediocre cards is not exactly a reason, in my opinion, to do anything about it. But I do think the choice between playing Lurrus or playing the 3-drops and higher should be a choice that actually has merit, and more merit than it has right now. I think right now it has some merit, but I'd like it to have a higher burden harder choice. And I think unrestricting Narset and Mentor are unlikely to do extreme shakeups on the format. I think both of those cards are closer to the safe side than the unsafe side. And those are the cards I'd like to see for Lurrus haters. So that is what I would do for this next ban restriction announcement. I would unrestrict Thorn of Amethyst, Monastery of Mentor, Narset, and Channel. And the reasons I would unrestrict them is because there are pieces of the community that would like to see change and have sentiments towards their specific styles of play that they feel are not being represented to enough. And so for those reasons, I would go for unrestrictions to help satiate that kind of sentiment. I would be strongly upset personally if Lurrus was to go in this next announcement. I think Lurrus is a net good for Vintage in terms of making games more creature-based, making games slower, and making more games that are not revolved around combo and the stack. And I would fear for a Fallout metagame, not the set, but the fallout of the metagame after a Lurrus ban that would involve a push back towards combo elements that I don't think are the most fun gameplay wise. And that's saying a lot because the Tinker Citadel is the one thing and Karn are the things I'm thinking of the most. And those are cards that I've won lots of tournaments with. Cards I'm very known for. I don't think those cards are good to have at the top of a metagame and as a large meta percentage. I like the ability to have a Tinker and Karn deck in the format, but I don't think you want it to be where I don't think you'd want to swap out this Lurrus Frog deck for a Tinker deck at the top of your metagame. And I don't know if people are there are a lot of new players who don't remember when that was the case, but for a good year and a half, Tinker Breach was by far the best deck in the format. And that was to a point that people wanted to ban Bolas' Citadel. People were saying same thing. We need to get rid of Bolas' Citadel because you can't restrict Bolas' Citadel because it doesn't matter. It's always only played as one of. And then, of course, there's the secondary aspect of we play Vintage to do things that you can't do in other formats. We play Vintage to play with the most powerful cards ever printed. And if you're getting rid of Lurrus in this format, you are basically exiling Lurrus from the history of Magic. And some people will want that, obviously. Some people really hate Companion to the highest degree. I think it's really awesome to have Vintage as a format be the format that you can play Lurrus in. And that's another point along the way here. So I have rambled on for a long time now. I hope that people enjoyed this kind of content, this more free-form, thought-flowing style. I'll definitely have a more scripted reaction video when the BNR happens at the end of the month, January 30th. So that'll be a quick video after that comes around about what I think is going to change in terms of how the metagame will shift based on the announcement. Maybe it won't shift because maybe it will be no changes. I would suspect we're going to get no changes, but I would be happy to see unrestrictions, and I would be sad to see any kinds of bans and restrictions. That's where I'm going to leave it at. Of course, this is your opportunity to let me and maybe any WotC designers who watch this video know in the comments below. You may tell us your community sentiment. Let me know what you think about the format. Do you think the format right now is fun? Do you feel like it's enjoyable? What kind of changes do you want in the format? Let me know in the comments below. And we're going to go back to gameplay videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.